ora. Thank you to the World Affairs Council. Thanks to Vivo for inviting me to come and speak. I feel like it's a great honor to come back to this campus, although when I was going to CC, this campus did not exist yet, but to be able to come and speak to all of you. So thank you very much for that. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is a place that probably few of you have ever heard of, with the exception of my husband, who's been hearing about it for 7 years now. And I was actually quite surprised when I was doing a bit of background for this talk to see that New Caledonia, because of the referendum, which I'll talk about, has actually been in American news. So this is just a screenshot from CNN, one of the more widespread stories about New Caledonia. So to give you, I am a geographer, so maps always need to be included in our PowerPoints. But I think that it's especially important because many people don't know where New Caledonia is located. So it is a collection of islands. It's not just one island, located generally in the South Pacific. I've got it circled up on the map here. I think it's about 1,300 kilometers from Australia, and then about 1,700 kilometers north of New Zealand. I have been fully indoctrinated into the metric system, if you haven't noticed, so I'm sorry I don't know what it is in miles. If I were to give you the CIA World Factbook or the encyclopedia description of New Caledonia, it might say something like New Caledonia is considered a sui generis collectivity of France, which means that it has its own unique status. The land area is about 7,000 square miles, so relatively the size of New Jersey, if you want to make a comparison. The population is about 283,000. I'm not sure what we're up to as far as population in Grand Rapids, so I don't know quite how that would compare. It has no official language, but primarily French is what's widely spoken. There are a smattering of Kanak, which is the indigenous peoples, Kanak languages that are still spoken, although they're not taught so frequently at school, which means the language is being lost some amongst the younger generations. Most people live in urban areas, about 70%, the remaining in rural areas, many of which are former tribal reservations. They're called tribu now. And then economically dependent, which it said if you read the bit about the talk, economically dependent on nickel. They're one of the largest exporters of nickel in the world. It's estimated that they have about 10 to 25% of the world's nickel deposits. So very reliant on that, which I'll mention later. So that's just to give you a brief bio about New Caledonia. The next thing, 2 maps, I'm really a geographer, is that we can't look at New Caledonia in the situation there in isolation. It is, if we qualify it as a separatist movement, which I think can be argued, as Mike said, there's this sort of larger context for separatist movements throughout the world. But even if we're looking at New Caledonia just within the Pacific, it's important to recognize that as an island nation, it's part of this much broader, actually very well-connected collection of thousands of islands. So you can see New Zealand and Australia obviously dominate the landscape. New Zealand, which is where I came from at 3 a.m. this morning. But you know, we generally divide the regions up, but this map gives you an idea of the extent and how these places are connected. And at the end of my talk, when I mention briefly some of the broader implications of what's going on in New Caledonia, you can think back to this map about the context in some of these other islands and this very connected landscape, despite being very far geographically from each other. Okay, so to give you an overview of decolonization in the Pacific, South Pacific, more or less. I've got some basic lists here because you can really divide these islands into two categories. Those that chose the more traditional route of decolonization, which is becoming a fully sovereign state. And you can see that there's a very definite decade time period aligned with those that did choose to become sovereign states. And even though I included the Marshall Islands, Palau, Micronesia on that half of the list, I did qualify them by saying that they are in a free association agreement with the United States. So they're sovereign, kind of. And so you can see that really around the 1980s, there was a shift, primarily among island politicians in how they viewed decolonization as sovereignty, which as a result of what was going on in those places that did become sovereign as far as political unrest, ongoing economic dependency, and a variety of other social issues, politicians in these other islands on the right-hand side were looking to those places as examples, and we're seeing the problems that they faced, and we're wondering, is there a better way? Is there something else that we can negotiate? Which has given rise to this category called subnational island jurisdictions, which the basic definition of these are island legal territories in an uneven federal relationship with a larger state. I just say they're creatively autonomous. So these are island nations that have developed a creative, usually federal, relationship with a larger mainland state, often one that's quite distanced. If we're looking at relationships between these islands in the UK, France, for example, the US, some are closer, especially the subnational island jurisdictions aligning with New Zealand or Australia. Bit of a different situation. But just to give you an overview of what decolonization has looked like in the South Pacific. And you can see I've listed not only those South Pacific islands that are part of the UN non-self-governing territories list, but also those that have created these unique relationships with their mainland states. So, bringing it to an even smaller scale, the situation in New Caledonia, as you might have briefly read on the CNN report, the big recent event was the referendum, which took place on November 4th. And the referendum question was essentially whether the country should become sovereign or not. But before I talk about the implications of that, it's important to understand the events that led up to that point, because New Caledonia does have this unique political situation that's unlike many other places, which has given the indigenous Kanak in particular powers that other indigenous peoples in these types of island states do not enjoy. Even within the Francophone Pacific, they are unique. So I'm going to skip over all the awful colonization that occurred, suffice it to say that it did, and skip to the 1980s when the events, literally called the events, which is interesting in itself that they don't call it a civil war, which could be argued that's what it actually was a series of really two major violent confrontations that ultimately led to the 1988 Matignon Accord, and then that subsequently delayed a decision on sovereignty for a decade. We then get the 1998 Noumea Accord, which again delayed a decision on sovereignty, brings us to the current referendum. But over the course of these two accords, a few notable things did happen, some of which I've outlined here. So that's when New Caledonia got its sui generis status. There was an irreversible transfer of powers from the French government to the newly formed New Caledonia government. So essentially, the intention was that all powers would be transferred except for the 5 sovereign powers, which include defense, foreign affairs, law, justice, and currency. Okay, so France would still control that, but New Caledonia would do everything else. That was part of the Noumea Accord. It also established a special electorate for the referendum, the one that just took place in November, basically defining who could and could not vote in that electorate, which, as you can imagine, ended up causing a lot of problems. So there's quite a bit of ongoing debate over that. And it also established this citizenship to be defined. So the idea that New Caledonians could have their own citizenship, but that it was something to be decided over the course of the referenda. So the reason that I've put 2020 and 22 on here is because what the Noumea Accord said was that by 2018, they would have to have a referendum on sovereignty, and if the answer was no, against independence, there would be a second one by 2022. Again, if the answer was no, there would be a third referendum in 2022, and once that is concluded, it's done. Okay, so a lot of the news media presented the referendum as a one-time thing. Very few of the articles I read actually talked about the fact that there would now have to be another one, which is quite interesting. So if we look at the timeline, you can then see that indicated. At the time that I did my interviews in 2014, I was talking with a lot of politicians in New Caledonia, and I asked them what types of questions would be asked in the referenda, right? Because it doesn't have to be a simple yes or no. Often there can be even more than 2 questions that are asked for what the eventual status will be. And so at that time, politicians talked about 4 different options. The first, the easy one, yes or no to sovereignty. No being association, continued association with France. But a few of them talked about some other options, one of which is this independent association, which is kind of like the situation that, those people have with the US, sort of similar, where a country is essentially independent. Whether or not you'd call that fully sovereign is debatable, but they would become independent, and then they would cede certain powers to usually a mainland state, but it could be some kind of collection of countries. Okay, so that was another option. And then a very few people said that there should be or could be an option for a third accord, which means a further delay on sovereignty. So, for instance, someone who would be anti-independence, we would call them a loyalist, said that a third accord would be a good idea because she believed that New Caledonia had the potential to be self-sustaining if sovereign, but not now. So they needed more time to grow, to mature, before they could make it as their own sovereign country on their own. Okay? But in the end, of course, the referendum was really a yes or no question about independence. So we'll see how they frame it for 2020. I thought this picture nicely summed up the yes or no. So my work really was looking at the time period leading up to the 2018 referendum. So I'm going to briefly talk about one concept that pervaded every aspect of debates around sovereignty, and that is rebalancing. This will also tell you a little bit more about the situation in New Caledonia. So I've broadly categorized it into economic, social, and political rebalancing. And this is for both pro and anti-independence leaders, essentially. they both saw this idea of rebalancing as this essential component of the referendum. It was just defined in different ways. So I mentioned earlier the primacy of nickel mining primarily. They don't do so much processing of it in New Caledonia. But nickel is really the core of the New Caledonian economy. They've tried to diversify in other areas with not much success so far. So historically, as you can imagine, mining was controlled by France. Eventually, some multinational corporations from Canada, and now I believe it's a Brazilian-Austrian conglomerate, control a majority of the nickel mining in New Caledonia. However, since the Noumea Accord, some of the nickel mining, the mines themselves, and a new processing plant have been given over to this Kanak indigenous-led organization. And there have been things around reinvesting that money in the local community, but also brokering partnerships with countries outside of the traditional French sphere, specifically South Korea. And when I was talking with politicians, there was this very definitive caution around branching those types of partnerships in nickel mining and processing with countries like China and the United States, which will have, when I talk about the broader implications, this will all come together. And so looking for opportunities with places like South Korea instead. Another component of economic rebalancing is the significant reliance on French aid, and that takes a variety of forms. So it's estimated that French aid is about let's do it in dollars, $1.5 billion annually. $1.5 billion in aid to New Caledonia, 283,000 people. Okay? It's quite a significant amount of money, one of the highest of all the French territories, I think only surpassed by French Polynesia. So significant amount of aid. They heavily subsidize education, health care, those types of social services, the economy as well. In part of that, I've put, this is actually a picture that I took of the jars of Nutella. So that translates to about, I think, 17 to 20 US dollars for that jar of Nutella, which is even more expensive than in New Zealand, and New Zealand is really expensive. So I think somewhere around maybe 75% of food in New Caledonia is imported from France. It's just insane. And that's because of some of the import controls that allow France to really dominate the market in New Caledonia and creates quite a high cost of living, which is a bit artificial because it's so heavily subsidized by the French government. So that's the economic situation. And there's really been an effort on both sides of the argument around sovereignty to try and reduce dependency on France as a result. So looking at social rebalancing, the main point that I want to highlight here leads into the discussion around who can and cannot vote on the referendum. So this unfortunately doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of French colonization, but it should give you some idea of the impact of French colonization on the demographics of New Caledonia, specifically the ethnic breakups of the population. So because French censuses don't like to talk about ethnicity or race, the data isn't perfect, and the other category, which you can see has the most growth, especially from 1970, does not really give a good indication of the actual situation, but to give you some sense of what's going on. Basically, France encouraged, strongly encouraged immigration from metropolitan France in particular to New Caledonia to marginalize the Kanak indigenous population. And it was really a targeted, strategic move to ensure that there would not be a majority in these kinds of votes, like the referendum. And I can get into a lot of the current politics around France's maneuvering, some of which are a bit anecdotal, so take that as you will. But there is a definite track record that's been cited in a variety of literatures about how France has encouraged migration to New Caledonia and continues to do so through its public servants and retirement of public servants policies in order to marginalize the Kanak vote. And so you can see some of that on here, although you'll notice that the European population has not necessarily increased. In fact, after 1996 has actually decreased somewhat. That's partially because of the way in which the census is written and how people have to self-identify or categorize themselves in census documents. So somebody who might, there's a lot of intermarriage, so somebody who might be part French, part Kanak, might identify as other, which gives us this large other category rather than identifying as one or the other. So that's not as well reflected in these types of charts. But there are certainly strong and ongoing inequalities between the European, whether it's New European or Old European populations, and the indigenous peoples. Huge, huge inequalities, which you see right away when you go to New Caledonia, especially around the capital. There's a lot of informal settlements that are kind of hidden up in the hills. They call them, well, they don't call the hills, but those more rural areas, especially around the capital, they call the bush, so in the bush. So one of the interesting things in terms of the referendum is that solving social inequalities, particular between different ethnic groups, has essentially been put on the back burner. And politicians will say, well, we'll deal with that after the referendum. We'll deal with it after the referendum's done, which of course, is now looking like another 3 years, possibly another 5 years, which has been kind of unfortunate. And on the other hand, some politicians actually, because there have been so many Kanak that have moved to the capital city, to the southern province, which is primarily anti-independence as opposed to the northern and loyalty provinces, which are more pro-independence. Politicians have used the promise of infrastructure in squatter settlements to get Kanaks who are registered in the pro-independence parts of the country. They've tried to sway them with the promise of infrastructure to voting for loyalists, which would change, it would shift what voting looks like in those other provinces. So that has also emerged as part of this. I really liked this. This picture is not from an article or a source about New Caledonia, but I think it kind of well describes the situation that's going on. But in terms of political rebalancing, to bring us right up to what's currently happening, there wasn't too much argument over the right to self-determination. The argument is about who has the right to self-determination and what does that mean. Okay. So if you think back to when I was talking about France's immigration policies and sort of the history leading up to the referendum and the Noumea Accord itself, one of the things that was embedded in the Noumea Accord was who has the right to vote on the referendum, which is quite important because the Kanak, as an indigenous peoples, are making the argument that some are making the argument that they have the sole right to determine the future of their country. Some say it is a right for them, and others who have lived in New Caledonia a long time, recognizing that when New Caledonia was originally settled by penal colonists from France, they were also victimized by colonization, and the forced laborers that were brought from Indochina, from other French holdings in the Pacific, French territories in the Pacific, the Kanak recognized that they were all also victimized by colonialism and therefore have a right to self-determination, to determine the future of New Caledonia. But outside of that, there's a big debate about more recent migrants and whether recent migrants, or who among them, have the right, if any, to vote on the referendum, to vote on whether New Caledonia should become sovereign. And that's really been an ongoing debate. There's a panel that meets every year to make decisions about who's added to the referendum electoral list. There have been debates around whether all Kanak, and what does it mean to be Kanak, but all Kanak who have customary status, whether they are automatically enrolled in the referendum electorate or not. So that's something that has been ongoing. The other component of political rebalancing is this idea of citizenship and who is a citizen. So it mirrors the debates around self-determination and ultimately won't be decided until after the final referendum is finished. But it's interesting to see, or to hear, I suppose, even the term for citizenship. Should it be New Caledonian? Should it be Kanaki New Caledonian? Should it be something else? Okay. It's something they're deciding. So as it currently stands, the requirements to be enrolled on the referendum electorate are quite expansive, so I won't read them all out to you. But if I can summarize them, if you have customary Kanak status, you're good. Alternatively, if you have lived in New Caledonia a long time, since 1994 or earlier, and have your main and moral interests, another one of those things that can be unpacked, in New Caledonia, then you are able to be enrolled on this electorate. So the implications. First thing, if you don't know already, if you didn't Google it before coming to my talk, the November 4 referendum ended in a no vote, as in no, New Caledonia should not become fully sovereign. And that really wasn't a surprise to anybody. So I go to conferences, I give these talks. Almost every time at the end, somebody asks me before the referendum, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think they're going to become sovereign? And I'd sort of smile and say, probably not. I'd be quite surprised. And that's ultimately what happened. The interesting thing, however, was how close the vote is. You might not think it's so close, given the percentages here, but it was very close. And even the pro-independence politicians were very surprised at how close it was. They thought they would have lost by a much greater margin. So that's quite interesting. And even though this is in French, you can see when I was talking about the provinces, here's the capital, Noumea. This line indicates the southern province, northern province, Loyalty Islands. The Loyalty Islands and the northern province are dominated by Kanak. Southern province is where you have much more ethnic diversity. And so I thought this map was kind of nice because although we don't have information about what percentage of Kanak voted for and against, and the same for the other ethnic groups, this map does give us a general indication because all of these areas that are in the, well, almost all of them that are in the dark blue, we can see from this orange map that those are places that are more than 70% Kanak. So we can see right off that for the most part, regions that were dominated by Kanak voted for independence. And then, not surprisingly, the major cities, Noumea being the largest, for the most part the urban southern province, And then the city centers, which are located on the coast in these two places, are the ones that, in general, voted against independence, okay, which is probably not surprising given the ethnic makeup of those regions. And Kanak generally more or less tend to be pro-independence, and everyone else tends to be anti-independence. Even indigenous peoples from other countries, from other Pacific islands, which is kind of interesting. So this was the result. We'll see what happens in 2020. The pro-independence leaders will obviously make a big push to ensure that all Kanak with customary status are on the electoral roll for the next referendum. We'll also see how many people are added because they become of voting age in the next 2 years. So it could shift the demographic divide a bit. I'd be a bit surprised if it changed these two numbers vastly, but we'll see what happens. So now on to the broader implications of the referendum in New Caledonia for the rest of the Pacific. And I'm going to give kind of a brief, just eyeing up the time, kind of a brief survey of all of the different major players in the Pacific and how this impacts them. So I've already talked a bit about the internal implications for New Caledonia leading up to the 2020 referendum. For France, France at the higher level, because if you ask the average French person, they most likely couldn't care less whether or not New Caledonia becomes independent. Many are probably quite frustrated at the amount of aid that France invests in New Caledonia. So when I'm saying France, I mean at the highest level of the government. So for the French, New Caledonia, along with France's other holdings in the Pacific, Australia's territories, and India, is seen as this, what French President Macron termed strategic access against China and advancing Chinese power in the Pacific. So France still sees this very important strategic value of New Caledonia, but also New Caledonia together with its other territories in the Pacific. So for France, it's about this competition with China and China's expanding influence in many Pacific islands, which sort of started out as this non-recognition of Taiwan in favor of recognition of the People's Republic of China, but has since become more about business interests and resources, and gathering new resources. Not quite on the scale of their efforts in Africa, but not inconsiderable either. So for France, this means Chinese expansion means increased competition over resources, which in New Caledonia's case is nickel. And politicians in New Caledonia, but also in French Polynesia as well, are using this threat of Chinese alliance to actually argue for greater rights, greater autonomy, if not sovereignty. So it's kind of interesting. And a colleague of mine at Massey, actually, he coined this term Andean Sovereignty, because there is really something particular about these arrangements that small island states enter into with these mainland, often former colonizers. That is quite different from separatist movements in mainland states. Okay, so in these situations, and really the core of Islandian sovereignty tends to be where islands vote against sovereignty, as we saw in New Caledonia. Politicians in these islands are able to negotiate constitutional exceptions. So at the very core level of a state, they can bend those laws and rules in a way that a region in metropolitan France never could do, or even Corsica, who has their own separatist movement. And they also, at the same time, are able to get these huge amounts of state aid, and they are allowed to enter into and sign international treaties. So essentially, island states like New Caledonia are having their cake and eating it too. Not to say that there aren't any downsides of these relationships, but there are a lot of benefits for them. So one of France's other strategic interests in New Caledonia is also the exclusive economic zone. So there has been some exploratory research done around oil and natural gas deposits near New Caledonia that's within its EEZ, which could be hugely valuable for France especially. Again, the nickel component. Also some research done about the potential for scientific and biodiversity as well, both on land and particularly underwater. New Caledonia also serves as France's Pacific military headquarters, which oversees security for underwater cable networks, air and sea links across the Pacific, shipment of products, including the nickel, things that are coming across from South America, from Japan. New Caledonia is really in that crossroads. So there's definitely this ongoing effort in France to maintain a hold of it. And they also have, another concern around the fact that all the other French territories and territories controlled by other countries are looking to situations like New Caledonia and saying, well, if they can become independent and do it successfully, maybe we could too. So there's also a concern around France losing some of its prestige as this global country, and its other territories perhaps leaving the Union as a result of the New Caledonia referendum, if they decide to become fully sovereign, of course. So for countries like Australia, the US, Japan, like France, their concern is primarily around counteracting Chinese power and expansion in the region. For Japan especially, the US has a pretty good foothold in the Pacific. If you've ever tallied up how many uninhabited military-based atolls the US owns in the South Pacific, it's quite a few. I didn't list them all on the list that I showed earlier, was just the inhabited ones. If I had made it the uninhabited holdings, it would have been more than a couple PowerPoint slides could hold. So for Australia and the US, these partnerships with France are really, again, part of this strategic counterpoint to China. Although the US spends perhaps less aid in the Pacific than Japan or Australia or New Zealand are. For other Pacific island countries, and I'm talking about small island states, not Australia and New Zealand, there's kind of this ongoing wariness of French control. Because New Caledonia's, one of its political parties is part of this international organization called the Melanesian Spearhead Group that was really started to support Kanak nationalism, and has a few other member countries in the Pacific. There's always this ongoing concern that France, through New Caledonia, is going to try and dominate those organizations that are really designed as a collective of these small island states, a way to broker in the international stage, if you will. And the concern isn't just around France, it's around Indonesia and some of these other places as well, that through these territorial regions, islands, whichever they might be, that they're going to move for greater control in those spaces. So that's also something that's going on alongside the New Caledonia referendum and is a concern, especially if the vote continues to be against sovereignty. And then, of course, you have all of those subnational island jurisdictions that I listed on that initial slide that are looking to New Caledonia to see what happens. to see if it is a success story, to see if it can negotiate, all but sovereignty from France, basically everything but sovereign, in name, which could certainly be of benefit. So you have all of these things that are going on within the Pacific, and certainly negotiating around, what the future of New Caledonia might be if it does continue to decide against sovereignty. So to wrap up, New Caledonia and the Kanak indigenous peoples themselves are truly in a unique situation, which we will see unfold in 2020 and perhaps in 2022. But they're making something different happen there. They're really negotiating this islandian sovereignty that can be quite beneficial for their people. So I will leave it there. Thank you all for your attention. Happy to answer any questions.